A missing man surfaced in the dark waters of a Texas swamp. Strapped against his chest was something chilling, a record of his final moments. For the Texas Rangers, it might be the key to unraveling a brutal double homicide. Police had a suspect in a cold-blooded killing, but they did not yet have the technology to tie him to the crime. Would science catch up before the killer slipped away forever? And when a body appeared along a Texas interstate, detectives were forced onto the road, determined to stop a homicidal trucker before more victims were left behind. In Texas, there is always room to hide. But killers in the Lone Star State have reason to fear. Even the fastest criminals cannot outrun the long arm of the Texas Rangers. The Rangers were called to an abandoned car sitting in a remote drainage ditch near Santa Rosa. The inside of the vehicle had been burned. A check of the license plate showed that the car belonged to Dalton Mercer, who had disappeared along with his girlfriend, Marissa Vega. It was the first real break in the case, and it was one the Rangers desperately needed. Once the car was pulled from the swamp, investigators noticed something even more suspicious. A rock had been placed on the accelerator. It looked as though someone had deliberately tried to dispose of the car and conceal a crime. But the fire, along with exposure to the elements, had destroyed all fingerprints and ruined any chance of linking the car directly to a suspect. The rock was the only clue authorities had. If the condition of the car meant anything, the outlook for Dalton Mercer and Marissa Vega was grim. Texas Ranger Warren Calder feared the worst. After the vehicle was found, search teams spread out across canals, brush, and swampy terrain, trying to locate Dalton and Marissa. At that point, the Rangers believed they had likely been murdered. They combed the area, certain the bodies could not be far from the burned car. They pushed through dense brush along the drainage ditch, searching for any sign of the missing couple. Even after an exhausting search, they found nothing. But the Rangers were not discouraged. They had built their reputation on solving cases that seemed nearly impossible. The Texas Rangers had been formed in the early days of Texas to protect settlers. Later, during the wild and lawless frontier era, they earned their name as fearless lawmen by tracking down bandits, bank robbers, horse thieves, and cattle rustlers. Today, they remain just as relentless. As a state police agency, they are trained in investigative and forensic techniques and assist local law enforcement with the biggest and most complex criminal cases. What had started as a simple missing person case was growing darker and more difficult with every passing day. Rangers questioned Marissa Vega's brother, who told them he had last seen the couple when he stopped by the trailer she shared with Dalton Mercer. That was the day Dalton and Marissa left to pick up Dalton's young daughter from his ex-wife's home. Dalton and Marissa planned to marry soon, and they hoped to obtain full-time custody of the girl. But their hopes disappeared as quickly as they did. From Marissa's brother, the Rangers also learned about Dalton's bitter custody battle. Dalton had the right to keep his daughter every other weekend, but his ex-wife, Heather Voss, did not like to cooperate. The pickups were always tense and painful. When investigators checked on Heather and her new husband, Garrett Voss, they discovered that the couple had moved out of their home shortly after Dalton and Marissa vanished. When Rangers finally caught up with them, Heather and Garrett claimed that Dalton had never shown up to pick up his daughter. The Rangers obtained a warrant to search the house the Vosses had recently vacated. Inside, a damp spot on the carpet caught the investigators' attention. They looked closer and found something puzzling. A small area on the back of the carpet had been painted over. It appeared someone had deliberately tried to cover something up. Sections of the carpet were sent to the lab. Technicians carefully removed residue with a cotton swab so they would not destroy possible evidence. A chemical that reacts in the presence of blood was added to the sample. The test came back positive. The blood was human. Because forensic technology was limited at the time, and because the paint had contaminated the sample, technicians could not determine whose blood it was. But they could tell there had been a great deal of it. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it. A closer examination of the house revealed tiny blood spatters on the walls and curtains. Samples were collected and sent to the lab. If the bodies were ever found, investigators could compare blood types. Something had clearly happened inside that house. But one of the most important pieces of evidence was discovered outside. It was not so much the presence of evidence as the absence of it. Crime scene analyst Nolan Marsh found an indentation beside a tree where a rock had once been. The rock from the abandoned car fit perfectly into the empty spot, like a missing piece in a puzzle. With those pieces coming together, the Rangers turned their attention to Garrett Voss, the husband of Dalton Mercer's ex-wife. This time, Garrett changed his story. He now admitted that Dalton and Marissa had come to the house to pick up Dalton's daughter. He claimed Heather and the girl were not home when Dalton arrived. According to Garrett, Dalton became furious when he realized his daughter was not there and attacked him. Garrett said he tried to defend himself and accidentally killed Dalton with a metal bar. He claimed Marissa heard the struggle and rushed inside. When she saw Dalton on the floor covered in blood, she attacked Garrett. Once again, Garrett said he acted in self-defense and accidentally killed her too. Shocked and terrified by what he had done, Garrett said he asked a friend, Russell Hayes, to help him dump the bodies in a drainage ditch. To get rid of Dalton's car, he brought along a large rock and placed it on the accelerator, hoping the car would drive itself into the ditch. But the plan failed, so he returned later and set the car on fire. Garrett admitted he had lied the first time because he was confused and did not think the Rangers would believe his story. Then he led investigators to the bodies. Marissa Vega was found floating in a drainage ditch miles from where the car had been discovered. Her skull showed damage that matched part of Garrett's account. But Rangers also saw that she had been shot in the head. That did not match his confession. Garrett was clearly lying. Dalton Mercer's body was found partially submerged in a steep canal. His head had been crushed. When the body was pulled out, detectives made a strange discovery. Under his shirt, strapped around his waist, was a small tape recorder. It had been badly damaged by water, but the cassette inside was still intact. The discovery was baffling. Rangers could not explain why Dalton had worn a tape recorder to his ex-wife's house, but they understood one terrifying possibility. Dalton Mercer might have recorded his own murder. The Rangers believed the clue that could seal their case had been strapped to Dalton's body. The tape recorder was handled with extreme care. Water and mud had ruined much of the mechanism, but crime scene analyst Nolan Marsh still hoped the cassette could be saved. The recorder had been one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence they found. After removing the tape, the Rangers contacted the FBI laboratory and asked what they should do. The answer surprised them. Because the tape had been submerged, they were told to put it back into water and send it that way. It was safer to keep the tape wet than to let it dry out. When the tape was returned, the FBI had done everything possible to preserve the recording. No one knew whether it contained anything useful, but within seconds of playing it, the sounds of Dalton Mercer being brutally murdered came through with horrifying clarity. Armed with the recording, investigators returned to the crime scene. They worked to match every movement and every sound captured on the tape. They measured distances and timed the events against the audio. The blood found inside the house had been matched to Dalton Mercer. Now the blood patterns would reveal even more. The stains on the wall had tiny tails, like teardrops. By studying and measuring those tails, examiners could determine the direction and angle from which the blood had traveled. Combined with the audio recording, they could reconstruct where Dalton had been when he was attacked. The tape told investigators exactly what had happened. Dalton arrived at the house and was invited inside. Heather Voss and her daughter could clearly be heard on the tape, proving that Garrett's claim was false. They had been home when Dalton arrived. Soon after Dalton entered, Garrett took out the trash. But the trash was only an excuse to step outside. He wanted to see whether Dalton had brought Marissa with him, and he needed to retrieve the crowbar he had hidden earlier. From the blood spatter and the sounds on the tape, it was clear that Dalton had no idea what was coming. He was seated, waiting patiently when Garrett struck. Garrett's accomplice, Russell Hayes, had been hiding in another room. Once Dalton collapsed to the floor, the two men went outside to kill Marissa, who was waiting in the car. Garrett's self-defense claim was a lie. These were not sudden acts committed in panic. They were cold-blooded attacks on unsuspecting people. While the tape continued to run, the killers carried Dalton out to his car and placed him in the trunk. They knew they had to dispose of the car as well as the bodies, so they took the rock with them. The hidden weapons and the presence of an accomplice proved the murders had not happened in the heat of the moment. They had been planned. What the killers had not planned on was recording their own crime. On the tape, investigators could hear the men searching for a place to dump Marissa's body. They could hear rocks striking the bottom of the trunk as the vehicle moved slowly. Garrett found a secluded area near a drainage ditch. Russell followed in his truck. The place was far from the road, and the grass was high enough to hide a body. But something had gone wrong. Marissa was still alive. The killers, however, had prepared for that possibility. On the tape, there was a single gunshot. Then came shouting that could not be clearly understood. A car door closed. The vehicle drove away. Soon after, the tape ran out. For some reason, the killers decided not to dump both bodies in the same place. They left Dalton farther down the road. The car was disposed of much as Garrett had described. The hardest part of the crime was over. Back at the house, however, there was still a great deal of cleaning to do. During the time Dalton had been left inside, struggling for life, a large pool of blood had soaked into the carpet. The conspirators rented a professional carpet cleaner to hide what had happened. But even that was not enough. Blood had seeped through to the underside of the carpet. To conceal it, they painted over the stained areas. To put the crime behind them, the Vosses moved out of the house soon after the murders. But nothing they did could erase the evidence Dalton Mercer had unknowingly recorded. Rangers later learned that Dalton had worn the recorder on the advice of his attorney. He wanted to capture the bitter confrontations and Heather's hostile behavior, hoping it could help him gain custody of his daughter. Instead, he recorded his own murder. Garrett and Heather Voss were sentenced to life in prison for the killings of Dalton Mercer and Marissa Vega. Russell Hayes also received a life sentence for his role. Most criminals unintentionally leave evidence behind, evidence that can condemn them, but sometimes proof is not enough. When even the latest technology cannot identify a killer, detectives can only wait for science to catch up. The Texas Rangers were later called to a secluded farmhouse in Burleson County. They had been asked to check on an elderly woman who lived alone. Neighbors had been unable to reach her by phone and feared something had happened. They were right. Evelyn Harrow had been murdered. Inside the home, Rangers found a gruesome scene. Evelyn lay partially undressed on her bed. The sheets were bloody. She had been bludgeoned and then smothered to death. The Texas Ranger Crime Lab in Austin was called in to process the house for evidence. Someone had clearly broken through the back door, and some jewelry appeared to be missing. It seemed Evelyn had surprised a burglar. There were no fingerprints to collect, and the weapon used to beat her could not be found. Investigators believed she had likely been smothered with her own pillow. They turned their attention to the body and the bed. Serologist Vivian Brooks, an expert in biological evidence, examined the crime scene and found signs that Evelyn had been raped. She and her colleague began carefully removing the sheets one by one. As they did, they collected every hair they could see from the sheets and bedspread. At that moment, it became clear that this was more than a homicide. It was also likely a sexual assault. To find the killer, Rangers began interviewing people in the area. They spoke with friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have information. No one could understand who would rape and murder such a gentle, elderly woman. Eventually, 3 men were identified by neighbors as suspicious for one reason or another. Detectives asked each of them to take a polygraph test. One by one, they were brought into the station, connected to the machine, and asked directly whether they had killed Evelyn or knew anything about her murder. Texas Ranger Everett Cole led the investigation. Several suspects came under review. One was a nearby neighbor. Another was a man who had later been picked up for indecent exposure. 2 men were questioned and released. The third suspect was a young man named Carson Reed Jr. He and his father had been doing work at Evelyn's house on the day she was murdered. A background check revealed that Carson had once been charged with sexual assault. He was questioned thoroughly, but he denied any involvement. The polygraph indicated he was telling the truth. All 3 suspects passed the test, leaving the Rangers with nothing. With no more leads, all they could do was try to make the best of the evidence they had. At the crime lab in Austin, Vivian Brooks and her colleague tested the biological evidence left by the rapist. Once they determined the killer's blood type, they compared it with samples from the 3 suspects. 2 suspects were eliminated immediately. The third, Carson Reed, could not be eliminated by the blood typing test. At that time, blood typing could only narrow biological evidence to one of several broad groups. Many people shared Carson's type, so the results were nowhere near enough to prove guilt. Still, it was all the Rangers had. They brought Carson in again. He had passed the first polygraph, but investigators believed that if he was guilty, he could not beat the machine twice. They decided to try again. He was easy to find. He was already in jail on a drug charge. Rangers suspected that if he had been under the influence during the first test, he might have been able to lie and still pass. This time, after being in jail, they believed he would be clean. They brought him back for a second polygraph with the same operator. He passed again. No other evidence could connect Carson Reed to the murder. Authorities had no choice but to clear him. For a long time, the Rangers struggled to find Evelyn Harrow's killer. Eventually, the case had to be suspended. A rapist and murderer was somewhere in the Lone Star State, and the Texas Rangers were powerless to stop him. The case sat cold, collecting dust. But as forensic science advanced, investigators saw a reason to reopen it. Serologist Vivian Brooks believed the new technology might finally make the remaining evidence useful. She had preserved what little material was left, hoping that one day science would offer a better method. The earlier comparisons between Carson Reed's samples and the evidence found at the crime scene had been inconclusive. Forensic examiners had done everything they could at the time, but a revolutionary method of analyzing DNA had since emerged. It allowed scientists to obtain DNA from tiny samples, such as a single strand of hair or a speck of blood, something that had not been possible before. Vivian was hopeful that the evidence collected from Evelyn's house could finally identify the killer. After the original investigation, Ranger Everett Cole retired, and Texas Ranger Wyatt Keller took his place. Wyatt approved further testing and reopened the file. He knew DNA testing was making enormous progress in narrowing down suspects, and he believed Evelyn Harrow's case was exactly the kind that science might help solve. As preserved evidence was sent to a genetics lab, Rangers began questioning neighbors and relatives again, hoping to learn more about Carson Reed. They soon uncovered disturbing information they had never heard before. Neighbors said Carson had a deeply troubling reputation. Reports described unusual sexual behavior, including acts involving animals. But the most useful information came from a man who remembered a strange and frightening night with Carson. A man named Preston Gale said Carson had appeared at his home late at night, claiming his car had broken down and he needed help. Something about Carson's manner felt wrong, but Preston reluctantly agreed to drive him back to the car. As they drove around supposedly searching for the vehicle, Preston's suspicion slowly turned into fear. Carson insisted on sitting directly behind him. During the entire drive, he idly wrapped an electrical cord around his hands. Eventually, Carson directed Preston to a remote area, but when they arrived, there was no vehicle there. Tired and uneasy, Preston finally drove Carson to a garage. When Preston got home, he still felt disturbed. He and his wife inspected their property and discovered that their phone lines had been cut. The story became even more chilling when Preston showed Rangers where Carson had directed him that night. Preston had no idea why the location mattered, but the Rangers immediately understood its significance. The route Carson had chosen led near Evelyn Harrow's property. Carson had returned to the area of the murder. Rangers knew it was common for killers to revisit the scene of their crimes, but that kind of circumstantial evidence was not enough to prove Carson was the murderer. They needed science. The lab ran complex DNA tests, comparing Carson's sample to the evidence from Evelyn's case. When the results came back, they were decisive. Carson Reed Jr.'s DNA was in the victim's bed sheets. The new evidence finally gave the Texas Rangers what they needed to arrest the man they had suspected for years. Once again, he was found in a Texas county jail, this time on a vehicle theft charge. Faced with undeniable DNA evidence, Carson confessed to raping and murdering Evelyn Harrow. In his confession, Carson told Rangers that he and his father had finished work around Evelyn's house and were ready to leave. They had spent enough time on the property for Carson to know that Evelyn owned gold jewelry. He believed there had to be more valuables inside. He returned to the house later. He claimed he had been driving around looking for something to steal when he thought of Evelyn. Her house was secluded. She was elderly and defenseless. The house was quiet when he arrived, and getting inside was easy. He had left a pipe in the yard earlier. Now it became the perfect tool, and soon the perfect weapon. Once inside, he searched the house. He slipped into Evelyn's bedroom and began going through her belongings. Then she woke up. Carson reacted by striking her in the head with the pipe. Before leaving, he raped her and suffocated her with a pillow. Carson Reed Jr. was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Evelyn Harrow. The conviction was a tribute to the Rangers' determination as much as it was a victory for forensic science. Without advances in DNA testing, the case might have remained unsolved forever. It is easier to catch a killer, even years after a crime, if he stays in one place. But Rangers take pride in tracking down suspects on the run. In a state as vast as Texas, that is often part of the job. There is usually not much to see along the interstate between Dallas and Oklahoma. But that changed when a Cook County officer spotted a body on the roadside near the Oklahoma state line. When Texas Rangers arrived, they found a dead white male. He had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest, neck, and face. A shoelace was wrapped around his neck. A sock had been stuffed into his mouth. From the condition of the body, it appeared he had been thrown from a moving vehicle. Nearby, investigators found a bra and a baseball cap. They also recovered a pair of men's underwear. The clues were vague, but they were enough to begin the search. Officers found no wallet or identification on the body. The victim was taken to the lab where fingerprints were collected. Texas Ranger Silas Ward was assigned to find the killer. A fingerprint match soon identified the victim as Dallas resident Travis Kane. Travis had a long criminal history and was the kind of man many people dismissed. He had little family beyond his parents, no money, no job, and a serious drug addiction. He had spent much of his life around trouble. As Ranger Ward investigated, some people asked why the authorities cared. But the Rangers did care. Travis was a person just like anyone else. Travis moved in a rough crowd. When officers tracked down his best friend, Beckett Shaw, they found him in a Dallas County jail on a drug charge. Beckett became the first suspect. He admitted he had been with Travis shortly before the body was found. He even acknowledged that the baseball cap at the scene belonged to him. But he insisted he had nothing to do with the murder. Beckett told Rangers that he and Travis had been partying at a motel when they met a truck driver and his girlfriend. The four used up Beckett's drugs. At the end of the party, Beckett asked the truck driver to pay his share. The truck driver said he did not have the money with him, but could go get it. Travis went with the couple to make sure they did not simply disappear. According to Beckett, the truck driver left his wallet and driver's license behind as proof that he would return. He said he was from Ada, Oklahoma, worked as a truck driver, and had a load to deliver out west. The wallet was meant as good faith, but the truck driver and his girlfriend never came back. Beckett admitted he emptied the wallet and threw away the driver's license. Unfortunately, that license was the one piece of evidence that could have supported his story and given the Rangers a solid lead. Now it was gone. To see whether Beckett was telling the truth, Ranger Ward contacted the Oklahoma Department of Motor Vehicles and asked about truckers who had recently applied for duplicate licenses. The DMV gave him a list. One name stood out, Nolan Briggs from Ada, Oklahoma. Police records showed that Nolan had been stopped for a traffic violation before the murder. At the time, he had been driving a truck registered to a freight company in Carrollton, Texas. He completed his job and returned the truck to the company. But soon afterwards, someone stole it from the lot. Nolan was later arrested while driving the stolen rig, but was released on bond. Dallas police sent Ranger Ward a mugshot. The Rangers placed the photo in a lineup and asked Beckett Shaw to look through it. Within moments, Beckett recognized the truck driver he had last seen with Travis. He pointed to Nolan Briggs. The investigation was gaining momentum, but to prove Nolan was the killer, the Rangers needed more than the word of a criminal. They needed proof. The freight company was relieved to recover its stolen truck. But now the rig was no longer just stolen property. It had become a major piece of evidence in a far more serious crime. The truck matched the description Beckett had given investigators. Rangers began to believe that Travis Kane had taken his last ride inside that vehicle. The Dallas Police Crime Lab was called to search the truck for signs that the victim had been inside. Rangers already knew Nolan had been in the cab because he had been arrested in it. Trucking records showed Nolan had driven the rig for work before returning it. After that, he stole it from the lot. It was reported missing and then recovered on the same day the body was found. Everything pointed toward Nolan Briggs. But Nolan had jumped bail. No one knew where he was. Investigators searched the cab and sleeper for clues. In the back on the walls, they found small spots that appeared to be blood. A closer inspection revealed even more blood under the mattress. Preliminary tests indicated that it was human. Detectives were confident that further testing would show it belonged to Travis Kane. The evidence was collected and sent for DNA analysis. Rangers believed they were now on the trail of the man responsible for the brutal stabbing. At the lab, criminalist Rowan Blake used DNA testing to compare the blood from the truck with a sample from Travis. But the results shocked the Rangers. The blood did not match Travis Kane. They had found blood in the truck, but it was not the blood they expected. That meant someone else might have been killed there. Then Ranger Ward received news that made the case even more disturbing. Another female victim had been found. She had a ligature around her neck and a sock in her mouth, the same kind of staging found with Travis. Ward's instinct told him Beckett had been telling the truth. There might be a serial killer driving a truck across America's highways. The case had taken a terrifying turn. At least 2 people were dead, and if the Rangers did not catch the killer soon, more bodies might be found along the road. The murders did not stop. Ranger Ward later received a call from police in Richardson, Texas, just north of Dallas. They had found another body. It was a woman with a string tied around her neck and a sock stuffed in her mouth. But this time there was a devastating twist. The dead woman was Nolan Briggs's mother. Nolan and his girlfriend, Kendra Vale, became prime suspects. They had stolen his mother's car and disappeared. When Ranger Ward spoke with Nolan's last employer, he learned that Nolan had been assigned to deliver a load to California. He picked up the truck, then never returned. Once again, Nolan Briggs had stolen a rig and vanished. This time the Rangers had a stroke of luck. They found the truck they were looking for. Nolan had driven it to Oklahoma City, used it for several days, and then abandoned it after it ran out of gas. Oklahoma City police found the truck. But before Rangers could respond, the trucking company brought the semi back to Texas and had it cleaned. The crime lab searched the truck for any evidence that might have survived. Fortunately, not everything had been erased. Stains were found in the sleeper under the mattress. They appeared to have been caused by blood. Judging by their size, a significant amount of blood had seeped through the mattress and onto the platform beneath it. But there was a problem. The mattress in the truck was brand new. The company had thrown out the old one, possibly taking critical evidence with it. By sheer luck, the trash had not yet been collected. Among the discarded items, investigators found an old stained mattress. The large stains looked like blood and matched the stains inside the truck. Detectives worried that exposure to the elements had damaged the evidence, but everything was sent to a lab in Austin for analysis. At the lab, DNA was extracted from the evidence. The strands were chemically cut into smaller pieces, allowing for an extremely precise comparison between the blood in the truck and the sample from Travis Kane. The results confirmed it. The blood belonged to Travis Kane. The match was so precise that statistically, it could belong to only one person. Nolan Briggs and Kendra Vale were found soon afterward. Dallas police caught up with the couple in Nolan's mother's stolen car as they headed east. They were separated and questioned individually. Once confronted with the evidence, investigators finally heard the truth about what had happened to Travis Kane. According to the killers, Travis had gone with them to collect the money Nolan owed. Nolan drove to a truck stop and told Travis to wait in the truck while he went to get the cash. But Travis grew impatient and decided to collect the debt another way. The killers claimed he climbed into the back and demanded sex from Kendra. She panicked and pulled a knife to defend herself. When Nolan returned and saw them arguing, he assumed Travis was trying to rape his girlfriend. In a rage, Nolan grabbed the knife and stabbed Travis. Kendra said she was so upset that she took the knife and stabbed him too. Nolan wrapped a ligature around Travis's neck and stuffed a sock in his mouth. Kendra said they left the body in the back of the truck until they were ready to dispose of it. She told investigators they drove around, continued using drugs, and eventually headed toward Oklahoma City. Somewhere along the interstate, Nolan climbed into the sleeper and used his feet to push Travis's body out of the side door. Although investigators could not secure convictions for the other 2 murders, Kendra Vale received a prison sentence for conspiracy to murder, and Nolan Briggs received life in prison for the death of Travis Kane. The determination of the Texas Rangers had paid off. This case captured what the Rangers had stood for across generations. There is an old saying among them: a man in the wrong cannot stand against a man in the right who keeps coming. And in this case, they kept coming. The Rangers made their reputation long ago by stubbornly chasing criminals across unforgiving terrain with whatever tools they had. They are still doing it today, now armed with the power of forensic science. Killers may keep running from the law, but with technology at their side, the Texas Rangers will never stop their relentless pursuit.